The museum had already been sealed. Police tape stretched across the marble entrance while federal vehicles filled the empty street. Curators whispered in tight circles. Security officers searched offices, storage rooms, and display halls with growing frustration. Near the back corridor, a middle-aged janitor quietly pushed her cleaning cart around shattered glass, as if it were just another morning. Nobody looked at her twice. One investigator glanced at her worn uniform and told her to stay out of the way. She nodded without argument. Then a convoy of black government SUVs stopped outside. A senior federal investigator stepped inside, ignored the museum director, walked past every executive in the building, and asked only one question. Where's her archive? The hallway fell silent. For the first time that morning, every eye turned toward the woman they had mistaken for nothing more than a quiet museum janitor. They had misunderstood who she was. They were about to discover why. The museum always woke before the city did. At 6:30 each morning, the lights came on one gallery at a time, revealing rows of sculptures, fragile manuscripts, and centuries-old paintings that had survived wars, fires, and revolutions. The silence inside the building was treated almost like another artifact, something that needed to be preserved. Before the first curator unlocked an office, before the cafe began preparing coffee, and before the security desk changed shifts, one woman had already completed the same route she had followed for nearly 12 years. Her name was Evelyn Carter. Most people simply called her the janitor. She never corrected them. A gray cleaning cart rolled quietly across polished stone floors. A ring of keys rested against her belt without making much noise. Her movements were slow, careful, and almost invisible, as though she had learned long ago that unnoticed people often saw the most. She paused beneath a large skylight inside the West Gallery. A small puddle had formed near the edge of an old window frame. Instead of wiping it away immediately, she looked upward first, not at the glass, at the ceiling beams. Then she opened a small notebook from her pocket. West Gallery, 6:42 a.m. Condensation increasing. Possible seal failure after last week's rainfall. She closed the notebook before drying the water with a clean cloth. Anyone watching would have assumed she was simply being thorough. Nobody realized she had recorded observations like this almost every day for more than a decade. The museum director arrived shortly after 7. Richard Holloway preferred everything to appear flawless before visitors entered. He walked through the lobby with 2 assistant curators discussing an upcoming exhibition featuring priceless medieval artifacts. The minister's office will visit next week, he said without slowing his pace. Everything has to be perfect. His eyes briefly passed over Evelyn. Morning. She nodded politely. Good morning. That was the entire conversation. By the time he reached his office, he had already forgotten seeing her. The conservation laboratory occupied the building's oldest wing. Inside, specialists carefully monitored humidity, light exposure, and temperature around delicate collections. Evelyn never entered without permission, but every morning she stopped outside the environmental display mounted beside the door. She looked at the numbers. Humidity, temperature, air pressure, nothing unusual. She continued walking. One young conservation assistant noticed her. You don't have to check that, he said with a friendly laugh. It updates automatically. I know, Evelyn answered softly. I just like knowing everything is working. He smiled politely, assuming she meant well. He had no idea she understood preservation standards better than many people inside the laboratory. Visitors believed museums stayed clean by themselves. Employees often acted as though they did too. Coffee cups appeared on display cases. Dust settled in forgotten corners. Emergency exits became temporary storage spaces. Someone always cleaned the mess before opening. Few people wondered who. Evelyn never complained. She simply did the work. When she found a brochure left beneath a display bench, she picked it up. When she noticed fingerprints on protective glass, she cleaned them. When she discovered a loose floor tile near the Egyptian exhibit, she placed a temporary warning marker beside it before filing another maintenance note. She never expected praise, only that the museum would remain safe. At 8:15, the morning staff meeting gathered inside a conference room overlooking the central atrium. Evelyn passed the open doorway while replacing a trash liner. Inside, Department heads discussed visitor numbers, budgets, media interviews, and preparations for the exhibition. Her name was mentioned only once. The cleaning schedule for Gallery 3 needs adjusting before Friday. No one asked whether she had suggestions. No one considered inviting her inside. She kept walking. The museum's oldest security guard, Marcus Bell, was one of the few employees who actually spoke with her. "You always beat me here," he joked while checking surveillance monitors. "You'll retire before I do." Evelyn smiled. "I doubt that." Marcus laughed. "You know this building better than the architects." She answered with a small shrug. "I've just spent a lot of time here." The conversation lasted less than a minute. It was more acknowledgement than she usually received all day. Later that morning, a school group arrived. Children filled the entrance hall with excited voices before teachers reminded them to stay quiet. One little girl accidentally dropped a notebook near Evelyn's cart. Before the child realized it, Evelyn picked it up and gently brushed dust from the cover. "There you are." "Thank you," the girl said. "You work here every day?" "I do." "You must know where everything is." Evelyn looked toward the galleries. "I know where most things belong." The teacher called the students forward. The girl waved goodbye before disappearing into the crowd. Evelyn watched them leave with a faint smile. Then she returned to work. Near noon, she entered a storage corridor that few visitors ever saw. Metal shelves stretched into the distance, holding crates awaiting future exhibitions. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet she stopped. Something felt different. Not dramatic, not obvious. Simply different. One storage cart stood several inches farther from the wall than it had the previous afternoon. A dust pattern on the floor had been disturbed. Nothing appeared missing. No alarms had sounded. No locks were broken. Most people would never have noticed. Evelyn quietly looked around the corridor. Then she knelt beside one wheel of the cart. Fresh scrape marks. Recent. She said nothing. Instead, she opened her notebook once more. Storage Corridor C, 11:57 a.m. Cart repositioned. Unknown reason. Verified tomorrow. She slipped the notebook back into her pocket. No report. No complaint. Just another observation. Years had taught her that facts became valuable only when they formed a pattern. And patterns rarely reveal themselves in a single day. She picked up her mop and continued down the corridor, disappearing once again into the quiet rhythm of the museum. Behind her, the storage shelf stood perfectly still. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But somewhere inside the museum, something had already begun. Morning sunlight slowly climbed across the museum's eastern facade, filling the entrance hall with a warm glow that softened the stone walls. Visitors admired the architecture without realizing how carefully every light level, temperature change, and air current was monitored inside the building. Evelyn Carter noticed those things. She always had. As she unlocked a maintenance closet, she paused for a moment. A faint smell drifted through the hallway. Fresh paint, not unusual in a museum, except no maintenance work had been scheduled in this wing. She quietly looked toward the corridor before making another brief note in her pocket notebook. East Hall, 7:03 a.m. Paint odor. Source unknown. She closed the notebook and continued with her routine. By 8 o'clock, museum employees had settled into another busy day. Curators prepared exhibition labels. Archivists cataloged incoming documents. Security officers rotated between camera stations and gallery patrols. Everything appeared normal. Only Evelyn seemed to notice how many small things no longer matched yesterday. A fire door near the loading dock remained slightly open. Someone had replaced a storage room padlock with a newer model. A maintenance ladder had been returned to the wrong location. Each detail by itself meant very little. Together, they unsettled her. She stopped beside the loading dock. A young delivery supervisor checked inventory against a digital tablet. "Morning," Evelyn said politely. "Morning. Were contractors here yesterday evening?" He looked up. "Not that I know of." "I noticed a new lock." The supervisor glanced toward the storage entrance. "Huh, I hadn't even seen that." He shrugged. "Facilities probably changed it. Maybe they had. Maybe they had not." Neither of them investigated further. Later that morning, Evelyn cleaned the floor outside the museum's archival storage rooms. The hallway was rarely busy. Researchers needed special authorization to enter. Most visitors never learned the rooms existed. As she polished the brass handle of one security door, she noticed faint scratches surrounding the electronic card reader. Tiny marks, almost invisible, fresh, not caused by ordinary use. She gently ran a finger across the metal. The edges still felt rough. Someone had recently worked around the panel. Again, she wrote only a single sentence. Archive entrance. Recent tool marks. The museum's chief of security, Daniel Brooks, happened to walk by. "You finding problems again?" he asked with an easy smile. "I've noticed a few unusual things." "Like what?" She hesitated. The archive door. He examined it for less than 5 seconds. "I don't see anything. The scratches are new." Daniel leaned closer. "Probably maintenance." "Maybe." He smiled reassuringly. "I appreciate how careful you are." Then he continued down the hallway. Evelyn watched him disappear around the corner. She respected Daniel. He took security seriously, but he relied on reports. She relied on observation. The difference mattered. Just before lunch, rain began falling outside. Water tapped gently against the museum's high glass roof. Visitors gathered near windows, watching the weather pass over the city. Inside Gallery 4, Evelyn noticed something unexpected. A small emergency exit sign flickered once, then stabilized. She looked upward. The backup power indicator remained green. No electrical alarms appeared. Still, she added another note. Emergency lighting fluctuated. Single occurrence. During her lunch break, she sat alone on a bench in the museum courtyard. She rarely ate inside the staff cafeteria, not because anyone excluded her, because quiet helped her think. She unfolded a simple sandwich and opened her notebook. Dozens of pages filled the small book. Dates, measurements, observations, humidity changes, window repairs, storage relocations, lighting failures, door replacements, water leaks. Nothing dramatic, nothing exciting. Yet together they formed a remarkably detailed history of the museum's daily life. A person reading the notebook might mistake it for maintenance records. It was much more than that. It was memory. Across the courtyard, 2 assistant curators talked while carrying exhibition plans. "I heard federal auditors are reviewing several museums this year." "Budget review? I think it's about artifact documentation." "That sounds like administration's problem." They laughed before walking away. Evelyn remained seated. She had heard enough. Artifact documentation. Interesting, not alarming. Just interesting. The afternoon remained calm. Children continued touring exhibits. Tour guides described ancient civilizations. Security guards smiled for family photographs. The museum looked exactly as it always had. Then, at approximately 3:15, a quiet alarm appeared inside the security control room. Not an emergency alarm. A system notification. Archive access log mismatch. Daniel Brooks frowned at the monitor. He refreshed the screen. The warning disappeared. Computer glitch, another guard suggested. Daniel nodded. Probably. Neither realized Evelyn had already noticed physical signs pointing toward the same area hours earlier. Near closing time, she returned to storage corridor C. Everything appeared undisturbed. The cart she had documented yesterday stood exactly where it had been left, but something else caught her attention. Dust. The floor beneath the lowest storage shelf showed a clean rectangular outline where an object had recently rested. Whatever had occupied that space was gone. No inventory tag remained. No label, only the absence. She crouched quietly. No panic, no assumptions, only evidence. She carefully measured the empty outline, using the width of her notebook, approximately 60 centimeters. She recorded the dimensions, then stood. Marcus Bell approached from behind. "You still working?" "I wanted to check something." He followed her gaze. "I don't see anything." She smiled politely. "I hope that's all there is." Marcus chuckled. "You always notice what the rest of us miss." She didn't answer, because she wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or a warning. As evening settled over the museum, employees went home one by one. Lights dimmed, security systems activated. The galleries returned to silence. Evelyn placed her notebook inside her locker before leaving. For a brief moment, she looked back through the empty hallway. The building felt different tonight. Not dangerous. Not yet. Just unsettled. Somewhere inside these walls, small changes were connecting into something larger. No one else could see the pattern. Not yet, but patterns. The following morning, the museum remained closed. The usual sounds of visitors had been replaced by quiet conversations and the steady movement of investigators carrying document boxes between offices. Every entrance was monitored. Every visitor log had been secured. Even employees needed temporary identification before entering their own workplace. Evelyn signed her name on the daily staff register without comment. The security officer handed back her badge. "Thank you, Ms. Carter." She nodded and continued inside. For the first time in years, the museum felt unfamiliar, not because the building had changed, because trust had. Inside the conference room, long tables were covered with open binders, acquisition ledgers from the 1970s, shipping manifests, restoration reports, maintenance requests, photographs of storage rooms taken decades apart. Special Agent Daniel Mercer moved quietly between the tables, stopping only when something required verification. Cross-reference every storage relocation against a renovation schedule, he instructed one of his analysts. "If a collection changed rooms, I want to know who approved it." The analyst nodded. "Yes, sir." No one questioned the order. Across the hall, museum employees waited to be interviewed one by one. The conversations were respectful but thorough. A curator was asked about an exhibition held nearly 20 years earlier. An archivist was questioned about missing catalog numbers. A retired facilities supervisor had been called back to explain renovation work completed before many current employees had even joined the museum. Most people struggled to remember. The investigation depended on details that time had almost erased. Evelyn passed the interview room, carrying a fresh container of cleaning supplies. The door stood slightly open. Inside, an investigator asked a simple question. Who maintained access to the lower storage corridors after the East Wing renovation? The administrator frowned. "I honestly don't remember. When were the keys changed?" "I'm not sure." "Who supervised the contractors?" "I'd have to check." Mercer quietly closed his notebook. "Please do. No frustration. No accusation. Only patience." Near the loading dock, technicians began reviewing years of digital security footage. Most recordings had already been erased according to the museum's retention policy. Only selected archives remained. One technician looked disappointed. "There isn't much left." Another replied, "Then we work with what's available." Mercer overheard them. "Evidence isn't only found on cameras. It hides in routines." Evelyn heard the sentence as she passed the room. For the briefest moment, she glanced toward Mercer. He was thinking the same way she had for years. Patterns, not isolated events. Later that afternoon, investigators requested access to maintenance workshops beneath the museum. The rooms contained shelves of old paint samples, plumbing records, electrical diagrams, and obsolete equipment that had not been touched in years. Dust covered nearly everything. Evelyn unlocked the workshop door. "It's been a while since anyone asked to see this place," she said quietly. One investigator smiled. "Sometimes forgotten rooms tell the best stories." She stepped aside. "Be careful with the top shelves." The brackets were replaced during the 2011 renovation. The investigator paused. "You remember that?" "I helped move everything before the work started." He thanked her and made a note. It seemed like a small detail. To Mercer, every reliable memory mattered. An hour later, another inconsistency appeared. One storage inventory listed a transport crate that no longer existed. The crate's identification number appeared in 3 separate records. Its final recorded location differed in each one. Room B14, then Corridor C, then Archive Annex. None of the records agreed. Mercer studied the paperwork in silence. "This wasn't an accident," one analyst suggested. "Maybe..." Mercer looked toward the floor plan. "Or maybe the building changed faster than the paperwork." Marcus Bell approached Evelyn near the central staircase. They've been asking everyone questions. They'll probably ask you too. She folded a cleaning cloth neatly. If they do, I'll answer. Marcus smiled. You always sound certain. I'm careful. There's a difference. She looked across the empty gallery. Usually, as evening approached, investigators pinned copies of floor plans across a temporary evidence board. Colored markers connected renovation dates with storage relocations. Old maintenance requests sat beside photographs taken decades apart. At first glance, the information seemed unrelated, but slowly, a picture began to emerge. Something valuable had not simply disappeared. It had been quietly lost beneath years of renovations, administrative changes, and forgotten records. Mercer stood in front of the board for several minutes without speaking. Finally, he said, "We're still missing one continuous record." The room fell silent. Not an artifact, not a financial ledger, a record of the building itself. One document that explained every structural change made over the past 30 years. Without it, the investigation could not move forward. Outside the conference room, Evelyn paused with her hand resting on the handle of her cleaning cart. She knew exactly what kind of record he was describing. She also knew why no one had found it, because the museum had never officially considered an archive. To everyone else, it was just a janitor's habit of keeping old notes. She lowered her eyes and quietly continued down the corridor. The moment of recognition had not arrived, but it was getting closer. Morning arrived with the same gray skies that had covered the city all week. The museum remained closed to the public for a second consecutive day. A temporary notice on the front doors explained that the building was unavailable because of an ongoing federal investigation. Reporters waited beyond the security barriers, hoping for a statement. None came. Inside, the atmosphere had grown quieter. The first wave of confusion had passed. Now came fatigue. Investigators had spent 2 full days examining thousands of documents, interviewing employees, and comparing decades of records. Every discovery answered one question while creating another. Special Agent Daniel Mercer stood before the evidence board. Colored tabs marked renovations. Blue lines traced storage relocations. Yellow notes identified missing documentation. One space remained empty. The structural continuity record, Mercer said. It should exist. An analyst adjusted her glasses. We've checked every archive. Twice. Mercer nodded. Then we're looking in the wrong place. Across the museum, Evelyn Carter pushed her cleaning cart through the east corridor. Her routine had not changed. Trash bins, display glass, handrails, floors. She worked with the same quiet precision as always. Several employees now watched her differently, not because they suspected anything, because everyone had begun noticing how calm she remained while the rest of the building lived under constant tension. Marcus Bell caught up with her near the staff entrance. They're still searching. I know. They worked until almost midnight. She smiled faintly. They're patient. Marcus lowered his voice. I've never seen federal investigators as determined. They must have a reason. I suppose so. In the conference room, Mercer reviewed another stack of renovation files. Every renovation creates paperwork, he said. Contract bids, engineering drawings, temporary access routes, safety inspections. He looked around the room. Buildings don't change without leaving a trail. The museum director sighed. We've given you everything we inherited. I believe you, but something survived. One of the younger analysts entered carrying another box recovered from basement storage. Last one. Mercer opened it. Old insurance documents, fire inspection reports, boiler maintenance schedules. Nothing connected to missing years. He closed the lid. No, still incomplete. Meanwhile, Evelyn unlocked a small maintenance closet beneath the western staircase. Unlike the museum archives, this room contained ordinary supplies. Cleaning solutions, replacement bulbs, old floor plans used by maintenance crews. A shelf held dozens of worn notebooks, secured inside simple cardboard boxes. Each notebook carried a handwritten year. Earlier volumes stretched farther back. Every page contained observations, repairs, Leaks, wall openings, temporary barriers, contractor access, equipment movement, storage relocations caused by renovations. Nothing classified, nothing secret, just careful records created by someone who believed details mattered. Evelyn looked at the shelves for a long moment before closing the door. At noon, another interview was interrupted. An investigator entered the conference room. Agent Mercer. Yes. We've confirmed 3 separate renovation contractors used different numbering systems for storage rooms. Mercer frowned. So Corridor C in 1 decade isn't necessarily Corridor C today. Correct. Silence filled the room. Then Mercer quietly asked, who would have tracked those changes? No one answered. Finally, the facilities manager spoke. We never had a central record. Mercer looked unconvinced. Someone always keeps records. Hours passed. The investigation slowed. Every department had exhausted its files. Every server had been searched. Every official archive had been cataloged. Progress stopped. The room grew silent. One analyst finally admitted, we've reached the end. Mercer remained standing. No, we've reached the end of the records people remembered. That afternoon, Evelyn replaced a damaged light fixture outside the conference room. The door was slightly open. She could hear only fragments. 30 years. Missing transitions. No continuity. She quietly finished tightening the final screw. As she turned to leave, Mercer stepped into the hallway. For the first time, he looked directly at her, not as a janitor, simply as another employee. Ma'am. She stopped. Yes. How long have you worked here? 12 years. And before that, I worked with the renovation contractors during the East Wing restoration. Mercer paused. You were here for that project? I was. He thanked her politely. Neither of them realized how important that brief conversation would become. Late in the afternoon, Mercer gathered his team. We're missing institutional memory. One analyst looked puzzled. The documents are incomplete because the people who created them retired. Exactly. He picked up an old floor plan. We're searching records. What we need is someone who watched the building change. Across the hallway, Evelyn quietly closed her notebook after recording one final maintenance observation. She had no intention of interrupting the investigation, no intention of volunteering information that had never been requested. Her notebooks had never been official records. They were simply habits formed over years of careful work. She assumed they held little value beyond maintenance. She was wrong. As the day ended, a black government sedan entered the museum courtyard. A senior official stepped out, carrying a seal case. He walked directly toward the conference room, without speaking to anyone else. Mercer greeted him with visible respect. The official handed over a thin folder. We found one reference. Mercer opened it. Inside was a single memorandum written nearly 11 years earlier. Only one sentence had been highlighted. If continuity records cannot be located through administrative archives, contact the maintenance observer assigned during the East Wing restoration. No name, no department, just one handwritten note in the margin. She keeps everything. Mercer slowly closed the folder. For the first time since arriving at the museum, he smiled. I think, he said quietly, we've been looking past the right person. The investigation had just taken its first real turn. The museum was unusually still the next morning. Even the investigators spoke more quietly than they had the day before. There was no sense of excitement, only the careful focus that came when months of preparation finally pointed toward a single unanswered question. Special Agent Daniel Mercer stood outside the maintenance corridor holding the memorandum. The handwritten note was short. She keeps everything. Nothing more. No name. No office. No explanation. He looked toward the museum's facilities manager. Who was the maintenance observer during the East Wing renovation? The manager searched his memory. I'm not certain. What about your records? They only list contractors. Mercer folded the paper. Then we'll ask the people. Evelyn was polishing the brass rail along the central staircase when Marcus Bell approached. Ms. Carter? She looked up. Agent Mercer would like to speak with you. She set the polishing cloth neatly inside her cart. Of course. There was no hesitation, no sign of concern. She simply followed Marcus through the quiet hallway toward the conference room. Inside, nearly every department head was present. Several investigators looked up as she entered. Some recognized her only as the woman who cleaned the galleries every morning. Mercer pulled out a chair. "Thank you for coming." She sat. Her posture remained calm. Mercer placed an old blueprint on the table. "Were you employed during the East Wing renovation?" "Yes." "In what capacity?" "I worked for the facilities contractor before accepting a permanent position with the museum." "You observed the renovation?" "I helped coordinate access for preservation crews and maintenance teams." The room grew quieter. No one had known that. The museum director looked surprised. "I wasn't aware of that." Evelyn answered honestly. "No one ever asked." Mercer opened another folder. "We spent 3 days trying to reconstruct changes made to this building." She nodded slightly. "It has changed many times." "You remember them?" "I remember most of them." One investigator exchanged a skeptical glance with another. Mercer noticed. He slid a floor plan across the table. "Then perhaps you can help us." He pointed to a hallway. "When was this wall added?" Evelyn looked for less than 5 seconds. "Spring." "Which year?" 2011. She traced a pencil lightly across the blueprint. The original contractor intended to extend the wall another 4 meters. They stopped because they discovered an older ventilation shaft behind the stone. The room fell silent. One analyst immediately checked the engineering records. 30 seconds later, she looked up. "She's correct." Mercer asked another question. "Why was storage corridor serial numbered?" "The sprinkler system." She answered without looking at any notes. The original numbering created confusion after the emergency exits were relocated. Another analyst checked. Again, she was right. One by one, Mercer continued asking questions. Old loading entrances, temporary storage rooms, contractor schedules, equipment routes. Every answer came immediately, never dramatic, never boastful, simply precise. The museum director slowly leaned back in his chair. "I've worked here 8 years. I didn't know any of this." Evelyn smiled politely. "My work took me to different parts of the building." Mercer watched her carefully. "You didn't memorize these details." "No." "Then how?" "I wrote them down." His expression changed. "You kept records?" "For maintenance." "Where?" "In my notebooks." The room became completely silent. "How many notebooks?" She thought for a moment. "I've never counted." "Approximately." "A little over 100. No one spoke. 100 notebooks. Created by the quiet janitor, almost nobody noticed. Mercer remained composed. "Would you be willing to show them to us?" "If they're useful, they may be exactly what we've been searching for." She nodded once. "Then come with me." She led the group beneath the western staircase to the small maintenance room. Most executives had never entered it. Metal shelves lined the walls. Cleaning supplies occupied one side. Cardboard archive boxes filled another. Each box was labeled by year, each notebook by month, everything arranged with careful precision. Mercer removed one volume. January 2014. Every page was dated. Every observation included the exact location. Maintenance activities, contractor access, temporary wall removals, artifact relocations, environmental concerns. Small sketches accompanied many entries. Nothing decorative, only facts. He opened another notebook, then another, the same consistency. Year after year, one analyst whispered almost to herself, "This is better organized than our official archive." Evelyn looked slightly embarrassed. "I never expected anyone else to read them." Mercer closed the notebook gently. "Ms. Carter." He paused. "These are not ordinary maintenance notes. They're a continuous operational history of this building." She looked at the shelves. "I suppose they are." Within minutes, investigators carefully transferred the notebooks to the conference room. No one rushed. Each volume was photographed before being opened. Gloves were worn. Evidence logs were completed. Mercer treated the notebooks with the same respect given to historical manuscripts. Not because they were old, because they were reliable. The first breakthrough came less than an hour later. An analyst compared Evelyn's notes from 2012 with an official renovation report. The official report claimed the collection had been moved directly from Storage B to Archive Annex. Evelyn's notebook recorded something different. Temporary relocation to Corridor C for 18 days while structural repairs were completed. Attached to the entry was a simple hand-drawn map. Mercer looked at the map, then at the official records. For the first time, the missing timeline connected. The artifact had never vanished. The paperwork had. The museum director quietly approached Evelyn. "I owe you an apology." She looked surprised. "For what?" "For never asking what you knew." She smiled gently. "You were busy running the museum, and you were helping preserve its memory." She said nothing. There was nothing to add. Recognition was never the reason she kept the notebooks. Accuracy was. As evening settled outside, Mercer stood before the growing evidence board. This time, every missing gap was slowly being filled, not by dramatic discoveries, not by hidden vaults, but by years of quiet, disciplined practice, by someone everyone had overlooked. The investigation changed direction before sunrise. Until now, the notebooks had been filling gaps in the museum's history. Now they began revealing something more unsettling. The official records were not simply incomplete. In several places, they contradicted Evelyn's observations. Special Agent Daniel Mercer gathered his team around the conference table. "From this point forward," he said, "we assume nothing." He placed one of Evelyn's notebooks beside an official renovation report. Every document is verified against independent evidence. No one argued. After 5 days inside the museum, everyone understood the value of the handwritten notebooks. An analyst compared 3 separate records describing the movement of a medieval manuscript collection. The official archive showed a direct transfer from the restoration laboratory to permanent storage. Evelyn's notebook told a different story. The collection had spent 16 days inside a temporary room created during construction. Another notebook explained why. A water pipe had burst inside the storage wing, forcing conservators to relocate dozens of artifacts while repairs were completed. The emergency move had been carefully documented by Evelyn. The temporary relocation had never been entered into the museum's official database. It was not evidence of theft. It was evidence of forgotten administration. Mercer stood quietly, studying both records. "So this isn't one missing event." "No, sir," an analyst replied. "It's decades of small documentation failures. And every failure made the next one harder to detect." Mercer nodded. "Exactly." By midday, the investigation board looked different. The red markers that had once suggested unexplained disappearances were gradually replaced with blue markers indicating verified movements. Entire timelines that had appeared suspicious now made sense. The building itself had been changing for years. Walls had moved. Storage rooms had been renumbered. Temporary vaults had become permanent. Departments had merged. Staff members had retired. Knowledge had disappeared one retirement at a time. The museum had not lost its history overnight. It had slowly forgotten it. The discovery brought relief to some employees. It frightened others. If the institution had forgotten so much, what else had been overlooked? The museum director sat quietly beside the conference table. "I always believed our archives were complete." Mercer looked at him. "They were complete enough for daily operations, but not for reconstructing 30 years of history." The director lowered his eyes. "That's my responsibility." "No," Mercer answered calmly. "It belongs to every generation that inherited these records." Later that afternoon, investigators reached the final discrepancy. An inventory ledger from 11 years earlier listed one ceremonial artifact as location unknown. The wording had fueled the entire federal inquiry. Mercer placed the ledger beside Evelyn's notebook from the same month. Her entry was brief. Artifact temporarily stored in Conservation Room 2. Transfer delayed due to climate control repairs. Verified by Restoration Supervisor. An attached sketch showed the temporary storage cabinet and the date it was sealed. The Restoration Supervisor had retired years ago. His handwritten initials matched the notebook. An analyst checked the museum's current storage database. The artifact was exactly where Evelyn's notes indicated it should be. It had never disappeared. Only the paperwork connecting its journey had been lost. No one celebrated. Instead, the room grew remarkably quiet. Weeks of preparation, thousands of documents, hundreds of interviews. The breakthrough had come from a notebook that had never been intended as evidence. Mercer closed the file. The investigation changes today. One analyst looked up. We're no longer searching for stolen history. Mercer nodded. We're correcting forgotten history. That evening, the museum director asked to speak with Evelyn privately. They stood inside the West Gallery after everyone else had left. The ancient paintings looked different in the dim evening lights. I spent years walking past you, he admitted. I knew your name. I knew your schedule. But I never asked what you were actually doing. Evelyn smiled gently. I was doing my job. You were protecting the museum. I was paying attention. The director looked around the gallery. Perhaps that's the same thing. She did not answer. Before leaving, Mercer approached Evelyn one final time. Ms. Carter. Yes. When this investigation is finished, your notebooks will become part of the museum's permanent historical archive. She looked surprised. They belong here. They've always belonged here. Mercer smiled faintly. I think they always did. For the first time since the investigation began, Evelyn looked toward the shelves of exhibits instead of the floor, not with pride, with quiet relief. The museum's memory had been restored, not by authority, not by rank, but by years of patient observation from the one person everyone had overlooked. By the end of the first week, the atmosphere inside the museum had changed once again. The tension surrounding a possible theft had faded. In its place came something far more difficult: accountability. The investigation had established that no priceless artifact had been secretly removed from the museum. The collection was intact. The evidence supported that conclusion. But the notebooks revealed another truth. For more than 3 decades, essential records had been allowed to drift apart. Departments had created separate filing systems. Renovation teams had documented changes differently. Successive administrations had assumed previous records were complete without verifying them. No single person had caused the problem. Many people had unknowingly contributed to it. That made the final report far more complicated. Special Agent Daniel Mercer gathered his team before their last series of interviews. Our responsibility isn't to assign blame where it doesn't belong, he said. It's to establish facts. One investigator nodded. The media will want names. The media doesn't determine our findings, Mercer replied calmly. The evidence does. The museum's board of trustees arrived that afternoon. Some had traveled overnight after learning the investigation was nearing its conclusion. They expected dramatic revelations. Instead, Mercer presented a timeline. Page after page showed renovation projects, temporary storage relocations, administrative restructures, and documentation gaps. No sensational language. No accusations. Only verified facts supported by official records and Evelyn's notebooks. The chairman of the board slowly closed the report. So we spent years believing our archive was complete. Mercer answered honestly. You believe what the available records showed. And they were wrong. They were incomplete. The distinction mattered. One word suggested misconduct. The other demanded responsibility. Later that day, the museum director requested a private meeting with Mercer. I have to ask, Richard Holloway said quietly. Will this become public? The investigation itself will. And our mistakes? Mercer considered the question carefully. The public deserves an accurate record. Richard nodded slowly. I understand. I inherited many of these systems. I know, but I also failed to question them. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Leadership, Mercer knew, often meant accepting responsibility for problems you did not create. Across the building, Evelyn continued her usual routine. She emptied waste bins from the education wing. She replaced worn protective mats near the main entrance. She tightened a loose display barrier outside the Maritime Gallery. To anyone passing by, it looked as though nothing had changed. Yet employees greeted her differently now. They stopped to thank her. They asked her questions about older parts of the building. Several younger staff members even carried boxes for her without being asked. She accepted every gesture with quiet kindness. Nothing more. That afternoon, one of the junior archivists found Evelyn organizing supplies beneath the west staircase. "I've been reading your notebooks," he admitted. She looked up. "I hope they helped." "They did." He hesitated before continuing. "I used to think record-keeping was just paperwork." She smiled softly. "It isn't." "What is it?" "It's memory. If memory disappears, people begin making the same mistakes again." The archivist stood silently, absorbing the words. There was no lecture, only experience. Meanwhile, the federal team completed its final verification. Every artifact identified in the original inquiry had been physically inspected. Every storage transfer had been reconstructed. Every unresolved discrepancy now had supporting documentation. Mercer signed the last evidence log before placing his pen on the table. "For the record," he said, "no evidence supports intentional removal or unlawful concealment of the protected collection." One analyst looked relieved. "So we're finished?" Mercer closed the file. "We're finished investigating." He glanced toward Evelyn's notebook stacked neatly in protective archive boxes. But the museum's work is just beginning. The following morning, museum employees gathered in the central atrium before reopening preparations began. The director addressed the staff without a podium or prepared speech. "The past week has reminded us that history is not preserved by buildings alone. It is preserved by people who care enough to protect it." He looked toward Evelyn. "For years, one member of this institution quietly preserved knowledge that the rest of us failed to protect." Evelyn lowered her eyes. She had never been comfortable standing in front of crowds. The director continued, "We owe her our gratitude." The applause that followed was respectful rather than overwhelming. It lasted only a few moments. Evelyn acknowledged it with a small nod. Nothing more. When the room became quiet again, she quietly stepped back into the crowd, exactly where she preferred to be. Later that evening, Marcus Bell found her replacing a light bulb in an empty corridor. "I suppose things will be different around here now." Evelyn secured the cover over the fixture. "Some things should be." "And you?" She smiled. "I still have tomorrow's cleaning schedule." Marcus laughed softly. "I should have known you'd say that." She picked up her cart. The investigation had changed how everyone saw her. It had not changed how she saw herself. There was still work to do. And tomorrow, like every morning before it, the museum would open its doors again. The museum reopened on a quiet Tuesday morning. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no dramatic press conference, only a small notice beside the entrance informing visitors that the museum had resumed normal operations after cooperating with a federal investigation. Families entered to the front doors exactly as they always had. Children hurried toward the dinosaur gallery. Tour guides gathered their groups beneath the central dome. Within an hour, the familiar rhythm of the museum had returned. To the visitors, it looked as though nothing had happened. Those who worked there knew otherwise. In a conference room overlooking the main atrium, Special Agent Daniel Mercer prepared the final briefing. The evidence board that had once been covered with unanswered questions was now neatly organized into a complete timeline. Every renovation, every temporary storage relocation, every maintenance record, every missing connection. The investigation had reconstructed more than 30 years of the museum's operational history. Mercer closed the final case binder. This investigation is officially concluded. The room remained silent. There was no celebration, only the quiet satisfaction that comes from finding the truth. The museum's board accepted the federal findings without objection. Several immediate changes were approved. A unified archival system would replace the fragmented records that had accumulated over decades. Maintenance documentation would be preserved alongside curatorial records rather than stored separately. Future renovation projects would require a continuous historical log so that no institutional knowledge would be lost again. None of the recommendations were complicated. They simply required consistency. One recommendation received unanimous approval. Evelyn Carter's notebooks would be professionally preserved digitized and added to museum's permanent historical archive, not as personal journals, not as maintenance notes, as official institutional records. When the motion passed, the room remained respectfully quiet. Everyone understood what it meant. The museum had finally recognized the value of work that had been overlooked for years. Later that afternoon, Mercer walked through the West Gallery one last time. He found Evelyn cleaning fingerprints from the protective glass surrounding the same 17th century navigation instrument she had been polishing on the morning the investigation began. She noticed him in the reflection before turning around. "I suppose this is goodbye," she said. "It is." He extended a neatly organized folder. Inside was a copy of the investigation's closing summary and a letter acknowledging her contribution. She accepted it with both hands. "Thank you." "No," Mercer replied. "Thank you. If you hadn't kept those records, we might never have reconstructed the truth." She looked down at the folder for a moment before carefully placing it inside her cart. "I was only writing down what I saw." "Sometimes," Mercer said quietly, "that's exactly what history needs." They walked together toward the museum's front entrance. Outside, the last federal vehicle waited near the curb. Before stepping into the car, Mercer looked back at the building. People often believe history is preserved by famous names. He glanced toward Evelyn. "This week reminded me that history is usually protected by people no one notices." She offered the same gentle smile she had worn throughout the investigation. Then she returned inside without another word. As evening approached, the museum slowly emptied. The final visitors left through the front doors. Security lights replaced daylight. The galleries became quiet once more. Evelyn pushed her cleaning cart through the central hall, exactly as she had done thousands of times before. She paused briefly beneath the skylight where she had once noticed a small leak. The repaired seal held perfectly. She made one final note in a new notebook. "West Gallery. Repairs remain stable." She closed the notebook and slipped it into her pocket. Then she continued down the hallway. There were no reporters following her, no photographers waiting outside, no ceremony, only the quiet sound of wheels rolling across polished stone. The investigation was over. The museum had recovered its memory, and the woman who had quietly protected that memory returned to the work she had never stopped doing. Several weeks passed. Life inside the museum settled into its familiar rhythm. Morning tours returned. School groups filled the galleries with quiet excitement. Researchers once again occupied the reading rooms. The temporary security barriers disappeared, and the conference room that had served as the investigators' headquarters returned to its usual purpose. To most visitors, the investigation was already a forgotten news story. To the people who worked inside the museum, it had quietly changed everything. The new archival system was already taking shape. Curators worked alongside facility staff for the first time in years. Maintenance records were now filed beside conservation reports. Renovation maps were linked to artifact movement logs. Departments that had once worked independently now shared the same historical database. It was careful, methodical work, exactly the kind of work Evelyn had always believed mattered. One afternoon, a newly hired archivist stopped beside Evelyn as she organized cleaning supplies beneath the west staircase. "I've been looking through the digitized notebooks." She smiled politely. "I hope my handwriting wasn't too difficult." The archivist laughed. "It was better than most official reports." He paused before adding, "I've learned more about this building from your notes than from any training manual." Evelyn closed the storage cabinet. "The building teaches you if you pay attention." "I think I understand that now." She nodded. "Good." Not everyone who visited the museum knew her story. Most walked past without recognizing her. Children asked where the dinosaur exhibit was. Parents searched for the nearest restroom. Tourists admired the paintings without noticing the woman quietly polishing the display glass. Evelyn preferred it that way. She had never wanted to become part of the exhibition. Late one afternoon, Marcus Bell joined her near the central staircase. He had a folded newspaper tucked beneath his arm. They published the final story. Evelyn looked at the front page. The headline described a successful conclusion of the federal investigation and praised the museum's decision to modernize its archival system. There was no photograph of her, no interview, no dramatic profile. Only one short sentence near the end of the article. Federal officials acknowledge the contribution of a longtime museum employee whose detailed maintenance records helped reconstruct decades of institutional history. Marcus smiled. They never even used your name. Evelyn folded the newspaper and handed it back. That's all right. They should know who helped. She looked across the quiet gallery. The important thing is that they know what happened. Marcus studied her for a moment before smiling. I suppose that's why you're different from most people. As closing time approached, the museum director found Evelyn replacing a small information sign outside the Maritime Gallery. I wanted to give this to you. He handed her a simple brass nameplate. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't an award. It was placed beside a shelf in the museum archives. Operational History Collection, compiled through the observations and records of Evelyn Carter. She looked at the engraved plate for several moments. It's very simple. The director smiled. It seemed appropriate. She nodded. It is. That evening, after the last visitors had left, Evelyn walked into the archive room alone. The shelves were quiet. Climate controls hummed softly in the background. Her notebooks now rested inside protective archival boxes, carefully labeled and preserved alongside the museum's official historical records. She gently placed one hand on the first box, not out of pride, out of relief. For years, she had worried that the details would disappear when she eventually retired. Now they would remain. Future conservators, future archivists, future caretakers. They would know not only what the museum displayed, but how it had endured. That mattered more than recognition ever could. She switched off the archive room lights and closed the door behind her. Then she collected her cleaning cart and began her final round of the evening. The same polished floors, the same quiet corridors, the same steady footsteps. Nothing about her routine had changed, only the way others understood it. Outside, the city lights reflected against the museum's stone walls. Inside, history rested safely in its place. Not because one investigation had uncovered the truth, but because, for 12 quiet years, one woman had believed that every small detail was worth remembering. She reached the front entrance, checked that the doors were secure, and turned off the final hallway light. The museum fell silent once more. Tomorrow morning, before anyone else arrived, Evelyn Carter would unlock the maintenance closet, take out her notebook, and begin another ordinary day, just as she always had. The end.